book of Joshua describes how the Israelites entered the land of Canaan, led by Moses' successor Joshua. They crossed the Jordan River near the city of Jericho. The narrative relates that when the priests stepped into the water carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the river stopped flowing at a place called Adam, approximately 30 kilometers north of Jericho. Joshua commanded that one man from each tribe should take a stone from the river. These stones were arranged in a special manner to create a holy place, a place of commemoration and worship.
Erecting stones was part of religious symbolic language in the ancient Near East. The erected stones, called matzevot in Hebrew, sometimes symbolized the people who worshipped. Sometimes they represented divinities. They always marked a holy place, a sanctuary. While the Joshua narrative does not use the term matzevot, the Israelite memorial stones were probably of this type.
The Israelites erected the stones at a place called Gilgal, at the point where they had crossed the river. The people camped for some time at Gilgal, and there they planned a military campaign to conquer the land of Canaan. While Gilgal must have been near Jericho, somewhere in this region to the north of the Dead Sea, called sometimes Arava, its exact location is unknown today.
The first chapter of the book of Judges reports that Judah conquered the south of Canaan with the help of the tribe of Simeon. The tribe of Ephraim, representing the house of Joseph, conquered the central hill country north of Jerusalem. Other Israelite tribes, such as Manasseh, Asher, and Naphtali, conquered areas north of the plain of Jezreel. The tribes of Reuben and Gad, and part of Manasseh, remained in the area to the east of the Jordan River.
The areas captured by the Israelites were usually already well developed. At the time of the Israelite settlement, the Canaanite population to the west of the Central Hills lived in many small villages surrounded by cultivated fields and terraces. The text of Deuteronomy chapter 6 describes it in this way: cities that you did not build, houses full of all good things that you did not put in them, cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant.
Much of the land of Canaan was hills, with only small valleys in between. This left relatively few flat areas that could be planted. The amount of land suitable for planting could be greatly increased by making terraces on the hillsides. The horizontal terrace could catch the rainwater that would otherwise run off. Terraces were especially good for planting olive trees, but could also be used for small amounts of grain or other crops. The preparation of terraces involved building retaining walls and filling in layers of different kinds of earth that would retain the water. It was a labor-intensive process, and a whole family had to work for a year in order to prepare about 1,000 square meters of terrace. Terraces have always characterized the western slopes of the land, where the rainfall was adequate for such farming.
In addition to the many small Canaanite villages, there were also a few larger settlements, sometimes called cities or city-states. These terms may be misleading to the modern Bible reader, as even these larger settlements rarely had more than a few thousand inhabitants. Unlike a village, which was an open grouping of small homes, a city had both dwellings and public buildings, and it was all surrounded by a wall for protection. While a village was only inhabited by farmers, the city could also include craftsmen and traders and officials. At the top of the social order of the city was a ruler, usually called a king. While cities varied widely in area, the average size was about 20 hectares, equal to a square about half a kilometer on each side.
There was never a unified nation of Canaan in ancient times. Instead, there were many small city-states. Many of these Canaanite city-states are mentioned in the Old Testament, including Hatzor, Shechem, Gezer, Megiddo, Lachish, Gaza, Ashkelon, Laish, which was later called Dan, and Jebus, which was later called Jerusalem. Many of the Canaanite city-states were situated along the way of the sea, or Via Maris, which linked Egypt with Syria.
The largest and the most important of the Canaanite city-states was Hatzor. It controlled the northern section of the Via Maris, the way of the sea, through the Galilee. The king of Hatzor dared to call himself king in his correspondence with the great king, the Pharaoh of Egypt. All other Canaanite kings called themselves dogs. The king of Hatzor commanded a great army that fought the Israelites under Joshua. Joshua defeated him and the other kings, and Hatzor was completely destroyed by fire.
To make the city easier to defend, it was usually built on a hill, or at least on elevated ground. A wall surrounded the city. To enter the city, you had to pass through a gate. While the design of city gates changed over the centuries, they were all built to make it more difficult for an attacker to break through the gate. One method was to make the gate complex much thicker than the wall, and to design it so that attacking soldiers had to pass through a relatively narrow opening while being vulnerable to attack from above.
When an ancient walled city came under attack from an enemy army, the gate was the most vulnerable part. For that reason, there was a special method of construction. There was an outer gate, where I'm standing right now, and then an inner gate. And as an enemy came in the outer gate, he had to turn left immediately. Why was this important? The soldiers carried a shield in their left hand, and in their right hand a weapon, a sword or a spear or a javelin. And as they came in the gate and turned to the left, all of their right side became vulnerable. This made it possible for the defenders on the wall of the area inside the gate to then shower them with stones or with arrows or with spears. City walls were sometimes constructed of two walls with a space between them. This is called a casemate wall. The space between the walls might be filled in with rubble to make one thick wall. In some cities, people built their houses in the space between the two walls.
The elders of the city often met inside or near the gate complex to discuss city affairs and make legal rulings.
The inside of an ancient town was made of a network of streets. Where these streets met, there was formed a wider space called a square. Like the streets, the square was usually dirt, only sometimes paved with stones. The square was open to the sky and often served as a gathering place for the inhabitants of the city. One of the squares of a town usually served as a marketplace, a central location for bartering, buying, and selling. The market square was often just inside the city gate.
In the excavations at the site of the Israelite city of Dan, archaeologists made a remarkable find: an ancient gate constructed of mud bricks. A similar Canaanite gate was found in the excavations at ancient Ashkelon. The city of Dan and this gate date back to the time of the Canaanites, roughly 600 years before the coming of the Israelites. The name of the earlier Canaanite city was Laish. The tribe of Dan was originally given a small territory on the seacoast, but they were eventually forced out of their tribal area, and they had to migrate north, where they captured Laish and renamed it Dan.
The first king of the northern kingdom of Israel, Jeroboam I, built sacrificial altars at Dan here in the north and at Bethel in the south. In other parts of the country, he also built new places of worship called bamot in Hebrew, or singular bama. The bamot built by Jeroboam were condemned by the biblical writers. The one excavated here at Dan is quite large, 19 meters long and 8 meters wide. While the word bama has often been translated as high place, it is easy to see that a bama was not necessarily located on a hilltop. Outside of the northern gate of Dan, archaeologists found this small platform with a base on each corner. The bases may have supported a kind of canopy to give shade to the one who sat underneath it. It is possible that the king sat here at the gate to judge cases brought to him by the people. Another possibility is that this platform was a kind of small bama, or high place, which was sometimes located at the gate of a city. Near the same gate was found also a long bench that may have served city leaders as they conducted their business.
As the buildings of a city were destroyed or fell into disuse, new buildings were built on top of the debris from the previous city. Over the centuries, this process had the effect of creating an artificial hill called a tell. The tell was surrounded by walls and piled up earth embankments called ramparts. Sometimes the wall was formed by the outer row of houses, built next to each other. This seems to have been the case with the house of Rahab in Jericho in the time of Joshua.
Archaeological evidence suggests that Jericho was not a large city. The Bible tells us that the city fell after a special ritual performed by the Israelites. For 6 days they marched one time each day around the city, led by priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant. On the 7th day they marched around 7 times. When 7 priests blew 7 ram's horns and the people shouted, the walls of Jericho collapsed. Nothing can be seen of Jericho's walls today, and little of the ruins of the city itself. In Joshua chapter 18 and verse 1, we read that the whole congregation of the sons of Israel assembled themselves at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. When the people of Israel entered into the land of Canaan, they brought with them the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant that they had carried in the wilderness for 40 years. The tabernacle and its ark were set up here in Shiloh in the center of the country.
Cultures and languages vary widely in their understanding of certain terms that describe landforms. It will be useful to see what certain landforms looked like in the land settled by the Israelites. The Hebrew word har, often translated as mountain, is used by the biblical authors with a wide range of meaning. Mount Hermon in the far north and Mount Sinai in the far south do indeed reach high elevations and can even be covered with snow. However, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal near Shechem, or Mount Tabor in the Galilee, are not very high at all. And Mount Zion in Jerusalem, where the temple stood, was lower than most of the area surrounding it. Many of the elevations called harim in Hebrew would only qualify as hills in many cultures. Mount Carmel, in the northwest of the country, in the tribal area of Asher, only reaches an elevation of some 550 meters, or 1,800 feet. The general area where Jesus is thought to have given his Sermon on the Mountain, near the Kinneret Lake or Sea of Galilee, actually stands below sea level.
Several Hebrew words indicate a flow of water throughout the year. The word Ye'or is usually used of the Nile River in Egypt. The most frequent word, Nahar, does indicate a year-round flow, but it says little or nothing about the actual size of the watercourse. The Jordan River, for example, is never more than a few meters wide and 2 or 3 meters deep. It is the largest river in the land of Israel. In fact, it is one of the few rivers in the land that flow all year long. In contrast, there are many places where water only flows right after a rainfall. The land has hundreds of these ravines or wadis, or seasonal streams. known in Hebrew as Nahal.
Many times, the Old Testament refers to events happening in the hill country. This term could easily describe most of the land, and it is often accompanied by a specific identification, such as the hill country of Ephraim. Most frequently, it refers to an area somewhere along the central ridge that runs north and south.
The largest valley in the land is the Jezreel Valley. It is bordered by the Galilee Hills on the north and the Gilboa Hills on the southeast. The city of Megiddo sat at the western edge of the Jezreel Valley. Megiddo was one of the strong city-states of the Canaanites. The Israelites captured it, and later King Solomon fortified the city. On the east end of the Jezreel Valley stood the city of Jezreel. Jezreel played an important role in the history of the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel. It controlled an important pass on the Via Maris that linked Egypt with Syria and Mesopotamia.
The wilderness or desert plays an important role in the biblical narrative. The best-known wilderness story, of course, describes the time spent there by the people of Israel after leaving Egypt. However, the wilderness figures in many other biblical events. It became a symbol of major importance for the prophets.
The wilderness or desert of the Bible lands is not usually a wide, flat expanse of sand dunes. In fact, the wilderness has a great variety of forms. The Sinai Desert, for example, is characterized by mountains broken up with valleys. The highest of these mountains, today called Mount Catherine, rises to an elevation of over 2,600 meters or 8,600 feet. The area is properly called a desert because of the extremely low annual rainfall, less than 100 millimeters per year. Because of this low rainfall, little vegetation grows in the wilderness.
To the north of the Sinai Desert is the region of the Negev, a name that means simply dry. While the Negev does not cover as much territory as the Sinai, it tends to be flatter. Many of the events connected with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob took place in the Negev. The word Negev, in the form Negba, meaning to the Negev, indicates the direction of south.
As we move northward, we will begin to encounter gradually higher levels of rainfall. Lying on the edge of the true desert is the wilderness of Judea. While there is more rainfall, it is generally not enough for the growing of crops, but only for grazing animals. This wilderness is bordered on the east by the Dead Sea and on the west by the central ridge on which stood the cities of Jerusalem and David's hometown of Bethlehem.
The Dead Sea is the lowest place on earth. Its water is almost 10 times as salty as the water of the ocean. It is referred to in Scripture as the Salt Sea, or the Sea of the Arava. The sea is fed by the water of the Jordan River and a few streams that flow into it from springs. Where these small streams flow, oases are formed. One such oasis is Ein Gedi. In this area, David took refuge from King Saul.
The Judean desert is characterized by many ravines or wadis. These are formed by winter rains flooding through, and they tend to be quite deep and narrow. They are also quite impassable, as you can see.
David fled to the Judean wilderness when King Saul wanted to put him to death. On one occasion, we read of David and Saul speaking to each other as if they were separated by only a small distance. This may seem strange when we consider that Saul and his men were trying to capture or kill David. While it would have been easy for David and Saul to speak to each other without even shouting, it would have taken Saul's men a long time to go around to where David stood.
While the wilderness is a barren, often inhospitable place, it appears in Scripture in several positive contexts. As in the case of David, it is frequently a refuge from danger. When Hagar flees from Sarah, the wilderness is also a place where God supernaturally supplies her needs. This theme of provision is repeated when Israel is in Sinai, when Elijah flees from Jezebel, and in other cases. Perhaps more than any other location, the wilderness is depicted in Scripture as the place where God speaks to people.
The dry southern regions of the country are indicated primarily by two names, the Negev and the Arava. The Negev is an elevated plateau with deep canyons. The Arava is a flat valley stretching to the south of the Dead Sea east of the Negev. In Scripture, the name Arava can also indicate the valley north of the Dead Sea and even some of the area just to the west of the Jordan River. Both the Negev and the Arava are extremely dry, and only limited agriculture was possible.
The time when the Israelites settled in Canaan coincides with the end of what is called the Bronze Age. Archaeological periods are named after the materials from which people made tools and weapons. During the Bronze Age, weapons and tools were made of bronze, which is copper mixed with tin. Starting around 1200 BC, people learned how to make implements from iron, which is harder than bronze. This begins what is called the Iron Age. Iron technology was introduced into the land of Canaan by the Philistines.
The Philistines were one of several non-Semitic groups known as the Sea Peoples. They invaded Canaan from the sea around the year 1200 BC, about the same time the Israelites were entering the land from the east. The Philistines organized themselves into a league of 5 city-states, composed of Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. In the course of time, they expanded their territories deeper into Canaan and came into direct conflict with the Israelite tribes, especially Dan and Judah. Between 1200 and 1000 BC, the period of the biblical judges, the Philistines controlled the coastal plain from Gaza north to the small stream called in Scripture Me Yarkon.
Until the Israelites learned how to prepare iron, its use was controlled by the Philistines. The use of iron in farming tools greatly increased the efficiency of farming and made the work easier. For preparing the soil for planting, the farmer used a plow. The plow itself was made of wood, but the point that pushed through the hard ground was covered with an iron sleeve. Another iron tool was the mattock, a kind of hoe for chopping the soil. It could serve also as an axe for cutting wood.
The pruning hook was used for cutting branches that were out of reach. For cutting the standing grain at harvest time, the farmer used a sickle with an iron blade. Farming tools and their use symbolized a time of peace. The prophets sometimes used this symbolism and the fact that some of the farm tools looked similar to weapons to speak of coming times of peace when weapons would be reshaped into farming tools. However, when the prophet Joel wants to call the people to war, he uses the opposite image, beating farming tools into weapons. Cultic objects and tools and pottery used by the Philistines show that they originated in